"She's too old to hold him," my daughter said, loud enough for everyone in that church to hear. And for a second, I thought I had imagined it. The words hanging in the air like something that didn't quite belong in a place meant for blessings and new beginnings. But then I saw the way her hand tightened around the baby, my grandson, and how she shifted her body just slightly away from me. And I understood that no, I had heard her correctly. Every single word, clear and deliberate, and I slowly lowered my hands, which had been reaching forward just moments before, hovering now in that awkward space between hope and rejection, before I let them fall gently back to my sides, as if I had never intended to hold him at all, as if I had simply been adjusting my coat or steadying myself on the polished wooden pew. Because at 68, you learn how to recover quickly, how to pretend that something small didn't just crack open inside your chest in front of a room full of people who suddenly found great interest in their shoes, their programs, the stained glass windows, anywhere but the scene unfolding just a few feet away from the baptismal font, where holy water shimmered under soft morning light. And I managed to smile, the kind I had practiced over decades of family gatherings and quiet disappointments, the kind that said everything is fine even when it clearly wasn't. And I stepped back, giving her space, giving them all space, because that's what I had always done, made room, softened edges, kept things peaceful, even when peace came at my expense. And the priest cleared his throat, continuing as though nothing had happened, his voice steady and calm, speaking of love and family and the sacred responsibility of raising a child. Words that felt strangely distant now, like they belonged to another family entirely, not the one I had spent my life building, not the one where I had once held my own daughter in my arms, whispering promises I had believed I would keep forever. And I glanced down at my hands, noticing for the first time the faint tremor in my fingers, subtle but there, betraying something I refused to show on my face, and I pressed them together lightly, as if in prayer, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for anymore. Maybe dignity, maybe clarity, maybe just the strength to stand there without letting anyone see that her words had landed exactly where they were meant to. And somewhere behind me, I heard a soft whisper, someone shifting uncomfortably, a quiet murmur that carried just enough to confirm that I hadn't imagined the tension, that others had noticed too, but no one stepped in, no one said a word. Because moments like these are inconvenient, and people prefer their celebrations smooth and uncomplicated, even if it means pretending not to see the fracture forming right in front of them. And I kept my eyes on the baby, on Noah, my grandson, dressed in a delicate white gown I had helped choose weeks ago, back when I still believed I would be part of this day in a way that mattered, back when I thought I would be the one holding him, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the warmth of his tiny body against mine, to whisper something soft and loving that only he and I would ever share. But now I stood a few steps away, an observer instead of a participant, a guest at a moment I had once imagined as something deeply personal. And Emily adjusted the blanket around him, her movements careful, controlled, almost rehearsed, as if she had already decided exactly how this day would look, who would stand close and who would remain at a distance. And I realized then, not all at once, but in a slow, steady way that settled into my bones, that this hadn't been spontaneous. This hadn't been a careless comment or a fleeting concern. This was something that had been building, something that had been said before in quieter ways, in smaller moments I had brushed aside, comments about me needing more rest, about things being too much for me now, about how they had everything handled, and I had accepted those words, trusted them even, because that's what mothers do. We believe the best. We assume care where there might be something else entirely. And I lifted my chin just slightly, enough to steady myself, enough to remind my body to remain composed, because whatever this was, whatever line had just been drawn in front of everyone, I wasn't going to cross it by reacting, not here, not like this. And as the ceremony continued, as the priest poured water over my grandson's head and spoke his name, I stood perfectly still, my smile unchanged, my posture calm. But somewhere deep inside, something shifted, quiet and precise, like a door closing without a sound, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost cold, that if I was too old to hold him, then I was also old enough to recognize exactly what was being taken from me, and more importantly, who was taking it. I remained standing through the rest of the ceremony, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my posture steady, my expression unchanged, and if anyone had glanced my way, they would have seen a composed woman, calm and dignified, exactly as they expected, exactly as I had trained myself to be over the years. But inside, I was listening more carefully than I ever had before, not to the priest, not to the prayers, but to the small spaces between people, the quiet exchanges, the glances that lasted just a second too long. Because once something shifts, truly shifts, you begin to notice what you once ignored, and I noticed how Emily kept her body angled slightly away from me the entire time, how she handed the baby to Daniel without hesitation, but did not once look in my direction again, not even by accident, as if I had already been placed somewhere outside the frame of this moment. And I noticed how Daniel avoided my eyes as well, his smile polite but distant, the kind of smile you offer someone you do not want to engage with. And I realized that whatever this was, it was not new to them, only to me. And when the ceremony ended and people began to gather, offering congratulations and soft laughter, I stepped aside instinctively, allowing others to move forward, friends, colleagues, people I barely recognized, each of them taking turns holding my grandson, cooing over him, commenting on how perfect he was, how beautiful, how lucky Emily and Daniel were, and I stood there watching, my hands still, my smile still in place, as one person after another was welcomed closer than I had been allowed, and no one questioned it, not openly, not directly, because everything looked normal enough on the surface, and that is how these things work. They do not explode, they settle, quietly, into a new arrangement where one person becomes less visible, less central, until eventually, they are simply not included at all. And I felt that realization settle over me with a strange kind of clarity, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like a slow turning of a key in a lock. And I thought back to the past year, to the small moments that had seemed harmless at the time, the canceled visits, the gentle suggestions that I should rest more, the times Emily had said she already had help lined up and did not need me to come by, the way conversations had become shorter, more efficient, as if I were a task to be managed rather than a person to be included, and I had accepted it, every bit of it, because I trusted her, because I believed that care was still at the center of everything. But standing there now, watching strangers cradle my grandson while I remained a few steps away, I began to understand that what I had taken as kindness might have been something else entirely, something quieter and more deliberate. And a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, Linda Hayes, approached me with a warm but careful smile, the kind people wear when they are not sure what they are allowed to acknowledge, and she touched my arm lightly, her voice low as she said it was a beautiful ceremony, that the baby looked strong and healthy, and I thanked her, keeping my tone even, and for a moment, we stood there in a silence that felt heavier than it should have, and then she leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping further as she added, almost hesitantly, that she had heard Emily say recently that things had been getting harder for me, that I was not as steady as I used to be, that I needed more help these days, and she paused, watching my face carefully, as if waiting to see how I would react. And I did not react, not in any visible way, because something inside me had already begun to reorganize itself, to shift from confusion into something more focused, more deliberate. And I simply nodded once, as if that information fit neatly into a place that had already been prepared for it. And Linda squeezed my arm gently before stepping back, her expression soft but knowing. And as she walked away, I remained where I was, looking out at the room, at my daughter laughing with her guests, at my grandson passed from one set of arms to another, and I understood, with a calm that surprised even me, that this was not about one moment, not about one sentence spoken too loudly in a quiet church. This was a pattern, a story that had been told about me slowly, carefully, until it sounded true to everyone who heard it. And if that was the story being built, then I would need to understand exactly how far it had spread, and more importantly, what it was meant to justify. I stayed until the last guest had taken their turn, until the laughter softened and the room began to thin, because leaving too early would have raised questions I was not ready to answer, and besides, I needed time to watch, to listen, to let everything settle into place so I could see it clearly without the blur of emotion. And by the time we moved into the reception hall, a bright space with long tables dressed in white linen and soft floral arrangements, I had already begun to notice how naturally everyone followed Emily's lead, how conversations seemed to orbit around her, how she guided the flow of the room with small gestures, a touch on someone's arm, a quiet word, a smile that signaled where attention should go next. And I realized that control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like charm, like organization, like being the one who seems to have everything handled. And I took a seat at one of the side tables, not assigned, just available, and no one questioned it. No one came over to redirect me, which told me more than if they had, because it meant my place was no longer something that required definition. It had already been quietly decided, and I folded my napkin carefully in my lap, smoothing it once with my hand, a small, steady motion that gave me something to focus on while I listened to the conversations around me. Fragments at first, bits of praise, admiration, comments about how well Emily had managed everything, how organized she was, how lucky she was to have such a strong support system. And then, woven gently into those compliments, I began to hear it, the subtle shift in tone when my name came up, the slight lowering of voices, the careful phrasing, words like, "It must be hard for her," and "at her age," and "Emily has really stepped up." And each phrase landed with a quiet precision, not harsh enough to draw attention, not sharp enough to be challenged, but consistent enough to build something solid, something believable. And I kept my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, even as I felt that same steady clarity deepen, because now I could see it, not just the outcome, but the structure behind it, the way a narrative had been constructed piece by piece until it felt like common knowledge. And I thought back again, this time more carefully, to the conversations I'd had with Emily over the past months, the gentle corrections, the way she would finish my sentences for me in front of others, laughing lightly as if it were a shared joke. The time she had insisted on handling things for me, paying bills when I had not asked, scheduling appointments I had not needed, always framed as help, always delivered with that same calm assurance that made it difficult to refuse without seeming ungrateful. And I had accepted it, because refusing kindness is uncomfortable, because questioning someone's intentions when they appear helpful feels unnecessary, and because I had trusted her, not blindly, but enough to let small things pass, enough to believe that we were still on the same side. And I saw now how those moments had not been isolated. They had been connected, each one reinforcing the next, until the idea that I was less capable had become something others could repeat without hesitation. And across the room, I saw Emily standing near the center table, holding Noah again, her posture relaxed, her expression bright, and people gathered around her, drawn in by that same ease she carried. And for a brief moment, our eyes met, and she smiled, not warmly, not coldly, but with a kind of measured acknowledgement, as if recognizing my presence without inviting it closer. And I returned the smile, just as measured, just as controlled, because there was no need to signal anything different, not yet. And as I looked at her, really looked, I realized that whatever she had set in motion, she believed it was working. She believed it was settled, that the roles had been defined and accepted, and that I would continue as I always had, quiet, accommodating, grateful for whatever small space I was allowed. And that realization did not sting the way it might have before. It did not rise into anger or hurt. Instead, it settled into something cooler, something steadier, a kind of awareness that felt almost like distance. And I lifted my glass of water, taking a small sip, letting the room continue around me, letting the conversations flow without interruption. Because for the first time since that moment in the church, I was not trying to understand what had happened. I already understood. What I needed now was to understand how far it went, how deeply it had been accepted, and what, exactly, it had been designed to make possible. By the time the reception began to wind down, I had stopped trying to follow individual conversations and instead let the room move around me, like watching a current instead of each drop of water, because it was easier that way, clearer, and I could see patterns I might have missed before. And what I saw was not sudden or chaotic, it was organized, almost gentle in its consistency. The way people approached me with the same tone, the same careful kindness, as if they had all agreed, without ever speaking together, on exactly how I should be treated. And one woman leaned in and asked if I was managing everything all right on my own these days, her voice soft with concern, and I smiled and told her that I was doing just fine. because that was still true, and she nodded with a look that suggested she was not entirely convinced, and I realized that whatever Emily had been saying, it had not been dramatic or extreme. It had been subtle, believable, the kind of statements that sound like care but settle like doubt. And that was what made them effective, because no one feels the need to challenge concern. No one wants to appear dismissive of someone who is just worried. And I could almost trace it now. The quiet conversations, the casual mentions, the way my name would come up in passing, followed by a small sigh, a gentle shake of the head, a comment about how things change with age and how important it is to have support. And over time, those moments would stack, layer upon layer, until the idea became something people accepted without ever questioning where it started. And I sat there, still and composed, letting that understanding settle deeper, because there was no urgency in it anymore, no rush to react, only the need to see it fully, to understand the shape of it before deciding what to do with it. And across the room, I noticed Emily speaking with a couple I recognized from church, her expression earnest, her tone low, and though I could not hear the words, I could see the rhythm of it, the way she leaned in slightly, the way the woman nodded with a sympathetic expression, the way the man glanced briefly in my direction before looking back at Emily. And that small glance told me everything I needed to know, because it meant I was part of that conversation even without being included in it. And I looked down at my hands again, resting calmly on the table, steady now, no tremor at all. And I thought about the years behind me, the decades of managing a household, of raising a child, of handling responsibilities that required precision, patience, and strength. And I compared that reality to the version of me that seemed to be circulating quietly through this room, a version that was fragile, uncertain, in need of oversight. And the difference between those two versions was not a misunderstanding. It was a construction, something built deliberately over time, and once I saw it that way, it became easier to separate myself from it, easier to understand that what people believed about me in this moment was not based on who I was, but on what they had been told. And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant the situation was not fixed, it was shaped, and anything shaped can be reshaped. And as that thought settled in, I felt something shift again, not sharp, not sudden, but firm, like a foundation settling into place. And I lifted my eyes, scanning the room once more, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone observing, measuring, taking note. And I realized that if Emily had taken the time to build this narrative, then she must have had a reason for it, something beyond simple distance or convenience, because people do not invest that kind of effort without purpose, and that purpose, whatever it was, would reveal itself eventually, in small decisions, in legal documents, in conversations that carried more weight than they appeared to. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself a slow breath, because for the first time since that morning, I was no longer trying to hold on to the role I had lost. I was beginning to understand the role I had been moved into, and more importantly, the role I could choose next. And as the last of the guests began to gather their things, offering final congratulations and warm goodbyes, I remained seated just a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, giving myself the space to let everything settle into clarity, because whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of hurt or reaction. It would be decided carefully, deliberately, with the same patience that had allowed me to see all of this in the first place. When I finally stood up to leave, the room had already begun to empty, chairs slightly out of place, glasses half finished, the kind of quiet disarray that follows a carefully planned event. And I moved slowly, not because I needed to, but because I no longer felt any urgency to rush, no need to catch up, no need to insert myself into conversations that had already moved on without me. And as I reached for my coat, I felt a presence beside me before I heard the voice, soft but deliberate. And it was Linda again, her expression different this time, less cautious, more certain, as if she had made a decision of her own. And she said my name gently, waiting until I turned fully toward her before continuing. And there was a pause, just long enough to signal that what she was about to say mattered. And then she told me that she had not wanted to bring it up earlier, not in the middle of everything, but that she thought I should know. And the way she said those words, measured, careful, told me that this was not casual concern. This was something she had been carrying, something she had debated sharing. And I simply nodded once, giving her permission without needing to say it out loud, and she glanced around briefly, making sure no one was close enough to overhear, before leaning in slightly, her voice low but steady as she explained that over the past few months, Emily had mentioned to several people that I had been forgetting things, that I had missed appointments, that I had needed help managing my finances. And as she spoke, she did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize. She simply laid out the pattern as she had heard it, one detail at a time. And with each sentence, something aligned more clearly in my mind, because those were not random concerns. They were specific, targeted, the kind of details that create a believable picture. And I listened without interrupting, my face calm, my posture unchanged, because reacting now would serve no purpose, not when the information itself was far more valuable than any immediate response. And Linda hesitated for a moment before adding that Emily had framed it all as worry, as responsibility, as something she felt she had to step in and handle, and that was what made it convincing. That was what made people accept it without question, and I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just steady, because now the shape of it was no longer abstract, it was defined, and I asked one simple question, my voice even, almost conversational, asking when these conversations had started, and Linda thought for a moment before answering that it had been gradual, but noticeable after the baby was born, and that answer settled into place immediately, because it gave everything context, timing, purpose, and I thanked her, sincerely, because she had given me something far more useful than sympathy. She had given me clarity, and as she stepped back, her hand briefly touching my arm again in quiet support, I turned toward the exit, my coat draped over my arm, and I walked out into the cool afternoon air, the sunlight softer now, the day already beginning to move on, and I paused just outside the church steps, not to gather myself, not to recover, but to think. Because for the first time, I was no longer looking at isolated moments. I was looking at a sequence, something intentional, something that had been building toward a result, and I considered what that result might be, not in terms of emotion, but in terms of outcome, because narratives like the one Emily had been creating are rarely just about perception. They are about justification, about preparing others to accept a decision before it is even announced. And I stood there for a moment longer, letting that thought settle fully, and I realized that if people believed I was forgetful, if they believed I needed help, if they believed I was no longer capable of managing things on my own, then any action taken on my behalf would seem reasonable, even necessary. And that was when it became clear, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty, that whatever Emily was planning, it was not limited to distance or control within the family. It was something more formal, something that would require agreement, witnesses, signatures, and that understanding did not frighten me. It did not rush me into action. Instead, it did the opposite. It slowed everything down, sharpened my focus, and as I walked toward my car, the sound of my steps steady against the pavement, I felt that same calm settle deeper. Because if this had been built carefully over time, then it could not be undone with impulse or emotion. It would require the same patience, the same precision, and I had both, more than enough. And as I reached for the door handle, I allowed myself one final thought, not bitter, not angry, but clear, that whatever role Emily believed I had been reduced to, whatever version of me she had presented to the world, she had made one critical mistake. She had assumed that I would never notice, and, more importantly, that I would never respond. The drive home was quiet, not in the heavy way it might have been before, not filled with replayed words or imagined conversations, but clear, almost deliberate, as if my mind had already decided that revisiting the scene would serve no purpose, and instead, I focused on details, the steady rhythm of the road, the familiar turns, the way the late afternoon light stretched across the dashboard, because grounding myself in something simple made everything else easier to arrange, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer carrying confusion, only questions, and more importantly, a direction, and I stepped inside my house, closing the door gently behind me, the quiet settling around me like something known, something stable, and I placed my coat over the chair, the same chair it had rested on for years, and I stood there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to mark the shift, to recognize that whatever had happened earlier was not following me in the same way it once might have, because now it had context, structure, and I walked into the kitchen, setting a glass of water on the counter, taking a slow sip, and I began to think through everything I knew, not emotionally, but practically. Because if Emily had been shaping a narrative about my ability to manage my own affairs, then there had to be a reason tied to something tangible, something that required other people to believe it. And I moved toward my desk in the living room, opening the drawer where I kept my documents, the ones I had always maintained carefully, not out of fear, but out of habit. And I pulled out a folder, flipping through familiar pages, property records, account statements, documents that reflected years of work, decisions, stability, and I sat down, scanning them with a calm that surprised even me, because there was no rush, no panic, only a steady awareness that I was looking at something that might soon become relevant in a way it had not been before. And I thought about timing again, about what Linda had said, about how these conversations had increased after Noah was born, and that detail settled into place more firmly now, because a child changes more than routines, it changes priorities. It introduces new considerations, new needs, and often, new expectations about the future, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the folder, and I allowed the pieces to align, not forcing them, just letting them connect naturally. And it became clearer with each passing second that whatever Emily had been preparing, it was not just about limiting my involvement. It was about positioning herself, about establishing a version of events that would make a future decision appear reasonable, even responsible. And I considered the possibilities, not in vague terms, but specifically, carefully, because there are only so many areas where such a narrative would matter, and each one pointed in the same direction: control, authority, the ability to act on someone else's behalf. And I did not react to that realization with alarm, because alarm would cloud judgment, and I needed clarity more than anything else. And I closed the folder slowly, placing it back into the drawer with the same care I always had, because nothing had changed yet, not officially, not on paper, and that distinction mattered. And I stood up, walking toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same view I had seen for years, unchanged, steady, and I realized that whatever Emily believed, whatever she had told others, it had not altered reality. It had only altered perception. And perception, while powerful, is not permanent. It can be corrected, redirected, if handled properly. And I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the window frame, feeling the solidness of it, grounding, and I understood that the next steps would not involve confrontation, not yet, because confrontation without preparation would only reinforce the very narrative she had been building. It would make me appear reactive, unstable, exactly as she had described, and that was not something I was willing to give her. And instead, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, because the path forward was becoming clearer, not through force, not through argument, but through patience, observation, and timing. And as I turned away from the window, moving back into the quiet of my home, I knew that whatever Emily had planned, she believed she had time. She believed I would remain exactly as she had described, unaware, passive, and that belief, more than anything else, was where her certainty would begin to fail. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always had, just after 6, not because I had to, but because routine has a way of holding you steady when everything else begins to shift. And I moved through my kitchen quietly, starting the coffee, opening the blinds, letting the early light settle across the counters. And there was something reassuring in the familiarity of it all, something grounding, because nothing here had changed, not really. And I carried my mug to the table, sitting down in the same chair I had used for years, and instead of letting my thoughts drift, I focused them, deliberately, carefully, because now was not the time for reflection, it was the time for observation, and I began to consider what I needed to confirm, not what I felt, but what I could verify, because feelings could be dismissed, but facts could not. And I reached for my phone, not to call anyone, not yet, but to review recent messages, appointments, the small details that might reveal a pattern I had overlooked before. And as I scrolled, I noticed something subtle but consistent, the way Emily had gradually inserted herself into conversations about my schedule, offering to help organize, suggesting she keep copies of certain documents, just in case, phrases that had seemed thoughtful at the time, practical even, but now, viewed through a different lens, carried a different weight, and I set the phone down, not alarmed, just aware, because awareness was more useful than reaction, and I stood up, walking into my study, the quiet room lined with books and papers that reflected years of order, years of control over my own affairs, and I opened another drawer, pulling out older records this time, documents that predated recent changes, because if something had shifted, it would show up in comparison, not in isolation, and I laid them out carefully on the desk, side by side, scanning them with a steady focus, looking for discrepancies, not expecting anything dramatic, just small differences, and there they were, not obvious, not alarming on their own, but present, subtle adjustments in how certain things were managed, automatic payments that had been redirected through joint oversight, permissions that had been expanded, nothing that removed my control, but enough to introduce another layer, another point of access, and I did not rush to interpret it. I simply noted it, because understanding required patience, and I leaned back slightly, my hands resting on the edge of the desk, and I allowed the pieces to settle again, because what mattered was not just what had changed, but how it could be used, and I realized that this was not about taking anything from me immediately. It was about positioning, about creating a structure where intervention could be justified when the moment came. And that moment, whatever it was, would likely be framed as necessary, even protective, and I stood there for a moment longer, letting that thought fully form, and then I began to put the documents back, not hastily, not nervously, but with the same care I always had, because nothing here required urgency, it required precision, and I returned to the kitchen, finishing my coffee slowly, my mind clear, focused, because the next step was not to confront Emily, not to question her directly, but to observe how she moved next, what she said, what she did, because people reveal their intentions not when they are challenged, but when they believe they are unobserved, and that was where the advantage lay, in patience, in silence, in allowing her to continue exactly as she had been, believing that nothing had changed, and I glanced at the clock, noting the time, because I knew she would likely call later, or send a message, something casual, something normal, maintaining the same tone she always used, and I would respond the same way, calm, composed, giving nothing away, because this was not about reacting to what had already happened, it was about preparing for what was coming. And as I rinsed my cup and set it in the sink, I allowed myself one quiet acknowledgement, not of what I had lost, but of what I had gained, clarity. And with clarity came control, not the kind that needed to be asserted loudly, but the kind that existed quietly, steadily, waiting for the right moment to be used. She did call later that afternoon, just as I had expected, her name appearing on my phone with the same familiar tone, the same casual timing that would have felt ordinary just days ago, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, giving myself that brief moment to settle into the version of myself she still believed existed, calm, unaware, unchanged, and when I picked up, her voice was warm, light, carrying that same practiced ease I had heard so many times before, asking how I was feeling after the ceremony, mentioning how busy everything had been, how overwhelming it was to host so many people, and I listened, letting her speak, not interrupting, because the way someone fills silence often reveals more than what they say directly, and she moved smoothly from one topic to another, never once referencing the moment in the church, never acknowledging it, as if it had not happened at all, and that absence spoke more clearly than any explanation could have, because ignoring something does not erase it, it defines how it is meant to be remembered, or rather, how it is meant to be forgotten, and I responded simply, my tone even, telling her that the ceremony had been lovely, that Noah looked healthy, that everything had been beautifully arranged, and there was a brief pause on the other end, subtle but noticeable, as if she were measuring my words, checking for something beneath them, but I gave her nothing else, no edge, no hesitation, just the same calm consistency she expected, and she continued, shifting the conversation gently, mentioning that she had been thinking about making sure everything was in order moving forward, that with the baby now, there were more responsibilities, more things to consider, and she framed it carefully, not as a concern about me, but as a general statement about planning, about being prepared, and I could hear it clearly now, the groundwork, the positioning, each word placed just carefully enough to seem reasonable, and I agreed lightly, saying that planning was always wise, that being organized mattered, and again, there was that small pause, that slight recalibration, because I was not resisting, not questioning. And that made it harder for her to adjust, harder for her to steer the conversation in the direction she might have expected, and she asked if she could stop by later in the week, just to go over a few things. Nothing urgent, just making sure everything was set up properly. And I said yes without hesitation, because refusal would have created tension, and tension would have accelerated whatever she was preparing, and I was not ready for that yet, not when there was still more to understand. And as we ended the call, her voice remained warm, consistent, but there was something beneath it now, something slightly less certain, as if she had expected a different response, a question, a hint of confusion, something she could respond to, but I had given her none of that, and I set my phone down slowly, not thinking about what had been said, but about what had been revealed. Because the invitation to go over a few things was not casual, it was structured, intentional, likely involving documents, explanations, a presentation of sorts, framed as assistance but carrying more weight than that. And I walked back to my desk, pulling out the same folder I had reviewed earlier, placing it in front of me, not to examine it again, but to remind myself of what remained unchanged, because that was just as important as what had shifted. And I rested my hand lightly on the cover, feeling its solidity, its familiarity, and I understood that whatever Emily was preparing to bring to that conversation, she believed it would align with the narrative she had been building. She believed it would make sense, that it would be accepted, and that belief was what gave her confidence, what allowed her to move forward without hesitation. And I stood there for a moment longer, my thoughts steady, my breathing even, because the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was simply unfolding, one step at a time. And as I closed the drawer again, placing the folder back exactly where it belonged, I knew that when she arrived later that week, she would come expecting agreement, expecting compliance, expecting the version of me she had already described to others, and what she would find instead would not be resistance, not confrontation, but something far more difficult to navigate, something she had not prepared for. And that realization settled quietly, firmly, as I turned away from the desk, the room around me unchanged, but the balance within it no longer the same. She arrived exactly when she said she would, not early, not late, just on time in the way that suggests preparation rather than coincidence. And when I opened the door, her expression was composed, warm in the way it always had been, but now I could see the structure behind it, the intention, and I stepped aside to let her in, offering the same quiet hospitality I always had, because there was no need to change anything on the surface, not yet. And she carried a slim folder in her hand, nothing bulky, nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest organization. And as she moved into the living room, her eyes scanned the space briefly, not critically, but with a kind of assessment, as if confirming that everything was as she expected. And I gestured toward the table, inviting her to sit, and she did, placing the folder carefully in front of her before smoothing her hands over it once, a small grounding motion that mirrored my own habits more than she likely realized. And for a moment, there was a quiet pause, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. And then she began, her voice measured, gentle, explaining that she had been thinking a lot about the future, about making sure everything was secure and well managed, especially now with Noah. And she spoke in general terms at first, about responsibility, about planning ahead, about how important it was to have systems in place. And I listened without interrupting, my attention steady, because I already knew this was not the point. This was the lead-in, the framing. And she opened the folder, sliding a few papers forward, aligning them neatly on the table between us. And she explained that these were simply documents that would allow her to help with certain things if needed, nothing drastic, nothing immediate, just a precaution, a way to ensure that everything would continue smoothly if I ever found it difficult to manage on my own. And there it was, presented exactly as I had expected, calm, reasonable, supported by the narrative she had already built. And I glanced down at the papers, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, because the details mattered, and they were exactly what I had anticipated. Permissions, authorizations, carefully worded language that shifted control subtly but significantly, not removing me entirely, but positioning her to act, to decide, to intervene, and I let the silence stretch just slightly as I finished reading, because silence has a way of revealing expectation, and I could feel hers clearly now, the quiet confidence that this would be accepted, that I would nod, perhaps hesitate briefly, but ultimately agree, because that was the version of me she had prepared for. And I looked up at her, meeting her eyes directly, my expression calm, unchanged, and I thanked her, sincerely, for taking the time to organize everything, because acknowledging effort costs nothing and reveals everything. And I asked a simple question, my tone even, asking when she had first started considering this approach, and for the first time, she paused, not long, but enough to register, and she answered carefully, saying that it had been a gradual realization, that she just wanted to be prepared, and I nodded, accepting the answer without challenge, and I reached for the papers again, this time not to read, but to align them, mirroring the precision she had used when placing them down, and I placed my hand lightly over them, not claiming, not rejecting, simply holding them in place, and I told her, calmly, that I agreed planning was important, that structure mattered, and that having things in order was always wise, and I could see the relief begin to form in her expression, subtle but present, because agreement, even partial, confirmed her expectation, and then I continued, my voice steady, explaining that I had also been reviewing my own documents recently, making sure everything was current, everything aligned with my intentions, and that I would be making a few updates of my own in the coming days, nothing urgent, just ensuring that everything reflected exactly what I wanted moving forward. And that was when the shift happened, small, but unmistakable, the way her posture adjusted slightly, the way her expression tightened just enough to suggest recalculation, because this was not part of the script she had prepared for, and I did not elaborate, I did not explain further, because information given too early loses its value, and I simply smiled, the same calm, practiced smile I had used before, and I told her that I appreciated her concern, that I would review everything carefully, and that we could revisit the conversation once I had completed my own updates, and I stood then, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with quiet finality, signaling that the conversation had reached its natural end, and she gathered her papers slowly, more carefully than before, her movements measured, her thoughts clearly shifting, and as I walked her to the door, the air between us was still polite, still composed, but no longer certain, and when she stepped outside, turning back with a small, controlled smile, I returned it just as evenly, because nothing needed to be said, not yet, and as I closed the door gently behind her, the house settling back into its familiar quiet, I stood there for a moment, not reflecting on what had just happened, but recognizing what had changed, because the balance had shifted, not through confrontation, not through resistance, but through something far more effective, awareness. And as I turned back toward the room, moving with the same steady pace as always, I understood that whatever came next would not be dictated by the version of me she had created, but by the one she had underestimated.